The year is 1944. The world is a maelstrom of conflict, and on the Western Front, the brutal fight against Nazi Germany rages. But in a remote, rain-swept corner of eastern France, high in the foreboding Vosges Mountains, a different kind of battle is unfolding, one that would etch itself into the annals of history, not just for its ferocity, but for the profound questions it posed about loyalty, prejudice, and the very soul of a nation. Imagine, if you can, a landscape swallowed by an unrelenting deluge. For 3 days, the heavens had wept an icy, soul-draining rain that transformed every foot of ground into a quagmire, every path into a river of churning mud. The air itself was a frigid shroud, clinging to uniforms, seeping into bones, and blurring the world into a dismal gray haze. Within the dense, towering pine forests of the Vosges, visibility was a cruel joke, plummeting to less than 10 feet. Every shadow seemed to conceal a threat. Every gust of wind carried the whispers of unseen enemies. Somewhere in this unforgiving purgatory, 275 American soldiers were trapped. They were the 1st Battalion, 121st Infantry Regiment, the legendary Alamo Regiment from Texas. For 3 agonizing days, they had huddled in shallow, waterlogged foxholes, surrounded, cut off, and besieged by overwhelming German forces. Ammunition was dwindling to precious few rounds. Food was a distant memory. And hope, that most vital of soldiers' currencies, was rapidly being spent. They were victims of a command decision that would, in time, be dissected and debated as one of the most controversial blunders in American military history. And, as German artillery shells methodically tore through the forest canopy, reducing their perimeter inch by bloody inch, their only salvation lay with an improbable, almost unbelievable rescue force. These were Japanese-American soldiers, men whose own families, whose parents, siblings, and loved ones remained imprisoned in American concentration camps back home, detained without trial, stripped of their liberty, all under the chilling shadow of Executive Order 9066. They were the Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, members of the 402nd Regimental Combat Team, and their motto was a defiant roar against an unjust world. Go for broke. What transpired over the next 6 days would become the stuff of military legend, a saga of impossible courage and staggering sacrifice. It was a rescue mission so costly, so brutal, that the very rescuers suffered more casualties than the number of men they managed to save. The 442nd would shed the blood of over 800 of its own to pluck 201 trapped Texans from the jaws of death. In doing so, they wouldn't just shatter German military assumptions about American fighting capability. They would force America itself to confront the deep, festering prejudices that lurked within its own heart. This is not merely a story of a lost battalion. It is a profound testament to what it means to be American, forged in the crucible of battle, paid for in blood, and etched forever into the moral fabric of a nation still struggling to live up to its own ideals. The crisis began, innocently enough, on October 24, 1944, with a decision that military historians now universally condemn as a flagrant violation of fundamental military principles. Major General John Ernest Dahlquist, the commanding officer of the 36th Infantry Division, issued an order that defied logic and disregarded the stark realities of the terrain and the enemy. He commanded the 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry Regiment, to advance beyond friendly lines, deep into the labyrinthine, densely forested Vosges Mountains. The objective, as stated, seemed straightforward on a map. Seize high ground near the town of Bifontaine and cut crucial German supply routes. But maps, as seasoned soldiers know, rarely tell the whole story of the ground. Lieutenant Martin Higgins, the battalion's astute operations officer, immediately grasped the suicidal implications of Dahlquist's command. He saw the dangers with chilling clarity. His unit would be advancing into a trap, utterly devoid of flank protection, with no reserves to call upon, and, most critically, without a secure, reliable supply line. The only connection back to friendly forces was a single, narrow logging road, a fragile lifeline that the Germans could, and almost certainly would, sever with ease. Yet, from his comfortable headquarters, many miles behind the churning front lines, insulated from the mud and the fear, General Dahlquist remained unyielding. He insisted on aggressive action, his orders echoing with the detached authority of a man unburdened by the immediate consequences of his pronouncements. This aggressive push, born of a general's ambition or perhaps a miscalculation of enemy strength, would condemn 275 American soldiers to a living hell. By noon on that fateful October 24th, the battalion had pushed approximately 4 miles through the unforgiving terrain, finally reaching their objective. A narrow, elevated ridge designated Hill 205. Exhausted, they quickly established defensive positions amidst the whispering pine trees, digging in, fortifying what little ground they had gained, and waiting. They waited for the rest of the regiment to link up with them, to consolidate their position, to provide the promised support. That link-up, tragically, would never come. The German 19th Army, under the shrewd command of General Friedrich Wiese, had not been idle. They had been waiting, meticulously planning for precisely this kind of American overreach. The Wehrmacht forces had deliberately executed a tactical withdrawal from certain positions, creating a deceptive vacuum, a deadly lure that allowed the unsuspecting Americans to advance deeper and deeper into what military strategists chillingly refer to as a planned encirclement. Once the 1st Battalion was firmly ensnared in position, isolated and vulnerable, the German trap snapped shut with brutal efficiency. From 3 directions, simultaneously, the German forces struck. Elements of the German 2001st Mountain Battalion, elite and hardened, seized the critical high ground overlooking the American position, turning it into an observation post and a firing platform. The 933rd Grenadier Regiment, a formidable infantry unit, moved swiftly to cut the fragile supply road behind the Americans, severing their last connection to the outside world. Additional German units, coordinated with deadly precision, sealed the remaining gaps, completing the encirclement. Within a matter of hours, the 1st Battalion was completely surrounded, not by a token force, but by an estimated 6,000 to 8,000 seasoned German troops, a numerical superiority that left little room for doubt about their ultimate fate. The Germans had not been idly awaiting this opportunity. They had spent weeks, perhaps even months, preparing an intricate network of defensive positions throughout the Vosges. They had constructed reinforced bunkers, dug deep, interlocking trench lines, and laid thousands upon thousands of mines, including insidious wooden shoe mines, designed specifically to be invisible to American metal detectors. Their artillery was cunningly positioned on reverse slopes, sheltered from direct observation and beyond the reach of American counter-battery fire. But perhaps most devastatingly, the Germans had perfected the use of tree-burst artillery. These shells were fused to explode not on impact with the ground, but high in the forest canopy. The resulting explosion unleashed a lethal, downward-raining shower of metal fragments and splintered wood, rendering shallow foxholes, the only protection the Americans had, nearly useless. Every explosion above them became a terrifying, shrapnel-laced curtain of death, turning the very trees that offered concealment into instruments of destruction. Within 24 hours of their complete encirclement, the trapped battalion's situation plunged from critical to catastrophic. German forces launched relentless probing attacks from multiple directions, keeping the Americans constantly on edge, testing their defenses, and slowly chipping away at their morale. Simultaneously, a constant barrage of mortar and artillery harassment rained down, preventing any rest, any respite, any moment of peace. The American soldiers, who had advanced with the expectation of a brief, aggressive push, carried only basic combat loads of ammunition. They had brought with them rations for a mere 3 days, assuming a swift link-up. Now, with the days stretching into an indefinite, terrifying eternity, these precious resources were dwindling to nothing. Water, however, quickly became the most critical shortage. The only accessible source was a small, muddy stream, located a perilous 60 yards outside their rapidly shrinking perimeter. It was completely exposed to a deadly gauntlet of German machine gun positions. Under the cover of darkness, men, driven by an agonizing thirst, would crawl out, pressing their bodies into the freezing mud as German tracer rounds arced overhead, trying desperately to fill canteens and even helmets. Many, tragically, never made it back. Each attempt was a roll of the dice with death, a desperate gamble for a few precious sips of water. Attempts to resupply the trapped battalion by air failed repeatedly. P-47 Thunderbolts from the 365th Fighter Group, risking their own lives in the treacherous mountain weather, dropped bundles of supplies by parachute. But in the dense forest, choked by fog and towering trees, most packages either drifted into German hands, landed in inaccessible ravines, or were simply lost forever in the wilderness. Of numerous supply drops attempted, the trapped battalion recovered only a handful, a stark testament to the unforgiving nature of the terrain and the effectiveness of the German encirclement. On October 26th, 2 days into the nightmare, other elements of the 141st Infantry attempted the first organized rescue mission. They pushed forward, desperate to reach their comrades, but were stopped cold by the impenetrable German defenses after advancing less than 800 yards. The 102nd Infantry Regiment tried next, attempting a flanking maneuver through a neighboring valley, hoping to bypass the main German strongpoints. Instead, they walked directly into a meticulously laid minefield, covered by pre-registered German artillery. They were forced to withdraw, suffering heavy casualties, their valiant effort ending in a bloody retreat. Throughout this ordeal, the battalion's radio operator, Erwin Blonder, maintained intermittent, fragile contact with division headquarters, using the unit's last functioning SCR-300 radio. Limited battery power meant they could only transmit twice a day, brief, desperate bursts of communication across the static-filled airwaves. As the days bled into one another, the messages grew increasingly urgent, increasingly desperate. Pleas for medical supplies, for ammunition, for immediate relief. Hope, tenuous as it was, hung by a thread thinner than a spider's silk. Finally, on October 27th, as conventional rescue attempts crumbled one after another, General Dahlquist made the decision that would forever define his controversial legacy. With the lost battalion teetering on the brink of annihilation, he ordered the 402nd Regimental Combat Team to break through to them. His exact words, recorded by his bewildered aide, were chillingly clear. "Get them out at any cost." This order, while seemingly an act of decisive command, was fraught with implicit bias and questionable judgment. The 442nd had just been pulled off the line after 9 brutal days of continuous house-to-house combat, liberating the towns of Bruyères and Bifontaine. They had suffered significant casualties, their ranks depleted, their equipment worn. They had been in reserve for a mere 36 hours, hardly enough time to integrate replacements, repair their damaged gear, or, most critically, to rest their exhausted bodies and minds. Many soldiers still wore their lighter summer uniforms, a cruel irony in the freezing, rain-soaked mountain conditions. The 442nd was, in every sense, unique within the American military. It was a segregated unit composed entirely of Japanese-American soldiers, or Nisei, second-generation Japanese-Americans. The tragic paradox of their service was stark. As they prepared to fight and die for America in Europe, approximately 120,000 Japanese Americans, including many of their own families, remained unjustly imprisoned in internment camps across the American West. They were detained without trial, their loyalty questioned, their rights stripped away by Executive Order 9066. This was the backdrop against which these men fought, a profound and painful irony that fueled their determination. Their unit's motto, "Go for broke," was Hawaiian pidgin slang, meaning to risk everything on one supreme, desperate effort. It was a philosophy they embodied with every fiber of their being. They had already distinguished themselves heroically in the brutal campaigns of Italy, earning more decorations in just 6 months than most units accumulated in years of combat. Their reputation for ferocity and unwavering resolve was already legendary. Lieutenant Colonel Virgil Miller, commanding the 100th Infantry Battalion, a storied unit attached to the 482nd, knew his men. He knew their exhaustion, their need for proper winter equipment, their depleted strength. He protested the order directly to General Dahlquist, pleading for a reprieve, a chance for his men to recover. Dahlquist's response, however, was cold and unyielding. American soldiers were dying, he declared, and the 402nd would rescue them. There was no room for debate, no consideration for the Nisei's condition. The implication, though unstated, hung heavy in the air. They were considered expendable. At 0400 hours on October 28th, under the shroud of pre-dawn darkness and persistent rain, the 402nd began their advance. The rescue plan was audacious, bordering on reckless. The 100th Battalion would attack on the right flank, the 2nd Battalion on the left, with the 3rd Battalion held in reserve, ready to exploit any breakthrough or reinforce critical points. The 522nd Field Artillery Battalion would provide supporting fire, but even their formidable firepower was severely hampered by the dense forest canopy and the pervasive, blinding fog, making accurate fire nearly impossible. Every shell fired was a gamble against the elements. The conditions they faced were beyond hellish. The ceaseless rain had transformed every narrow path, every ravine, every slope into a treacherous river of mud, sucking at boots, sapping strength, and making every step an arduous battle. The Germans, with their weeks of meticulous preparation, had constructed interlocking fields of fire, positioned machine guns to cover every approach, laid mines along every conceivable avenue of advance, and pre-registered their artillery on every likely route the Americans might take. It was a death trap, laid with painstaking precision. The first contact came just after dawn. Lead elements of Company E, pushing through the thick undergrowth, walked directly into a brutal ambush. German MG-42 machine guns, notorious for their terrifying rate of fire, opened up from concealed positions at point-blank range. Within a matter of seconds, multiple soldiers crumpled to the sodden ground, cut down by the torrent of lead. It was a horrifying, instant baptism of fire. The 405 seconds response, however, was not one of withdrawal or cautious maneuvering. It was immediate, violent, and utterly unconventional. Rather than seeking cover and calling for artillery, rather than falling back to regroup, they did something that defied American military doctrine. They fixed bayonets, and they charged. Directly into the teeth of the German positions, into the face of a hail of machine gun fire. This tactic, a frontal assault against fortified positions, was a direct violation of established American military doctrine, which heavily emphasized firepower and maneuver over direct, costly charges. But the Nice soldiers had learned a hard-won lesson in Italy. Aggressive, close-quarters combat could, at times, overcome even the most formidable defensive advantages. The Germans, trained to expect American forces to withdraw, to fall back and regroup when faced with heavy casualties, were psychologically unprepared for an enemy that kept advancing, kept coming, even as their ranks thinned and their comrades fell. The sheer, unyielding ferocity of the Nice's attack was a psychological shockwave that rippled through the German lines, destabilizing their carefully constructed defenses. On the opposite flank, Company K ran into an even more insidious threat, a meticulously laid minefield. The first mine detonated with a sickening thud, tearing off a soldier's foot at the ankle. As medics bravely rushed forward, more mines detonated, adding to the carnage. The company was forced to halt, pinned down not by direct fire, but by the unseen horror beneath their feet. Engineers, exhibiting extraordinary courage, crawled forward on their bellies, inch by agonizing inch, probing the mud with bayonets, desperately searching for the hidden killers. Every movement was fraught with mortal danger, every second a test of nerves. By the end of that first brutal day, October 28th, the 402nd had advanced less than a mile. The cost was tremendous, measured in blood and shattered lives. But they had achieved something vital. They had identified the main German defensive line, a formidable series of ridges that completely blocked access to the lost battalion. The path forward was clear, but it was paved with German steel and Nice blood. October 29th and 30th would plunge the Vosges Mountains into some of the most intense, desperate combat of World War II. The critical terrain feature, the linchpin of the German defense, was Hill 617, a steep, jagged ridge that dominated all approaches to the lost battalion's position. The Germans, understanding its strategic importance, had transformed it into an impregnable fortress. They had dug 3 separate, reinforced trench lines, constructed concrete bunkers impervious to all but the heaviest artillery, and positioned their pre-registered artillery to provide devastating support to every inch of its slopes. The assault on Hill 617 began at dawn, heralded by a massive artillery barrage from the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion. For 3 hours, over 4,000 rounds of high explosives rained down on the German positions, shaking the very foundations of the mountain. Yet, When the 402nd Infantry advanced, they were met with a withering storm of fire. The German bunkers, built into the reverse slopes, had largely survived intact, offering their defenders sanctuary from the shelling and turning the assault into a deadly uphill climb. What happened next has become legendary in military history, a testament to individual courage in the face of impossible odds. Seeing their attacks falter, their platoons pinned down, individual soldiers, fueled by an almost mystical determination, performed acts of extraordinary heroism that defied belief. Private Barney Hajiro, a recent replacement soldier from Hawaii, found himself amidst this carnage. Seeing his company stalled under a relentless torrent of machine gun fire, he did the unthinkable. He stood up. In full, unobstructed view of the German positions, he walked forward, a lone figure silhouetted against the chaos, directly into the hail of machine gun fire. He single-handedly assaulted and destroyed 2 German machine gun nests, silencing their murderous chatter. Then, with a fierce resolve, he eliminated 2 German snipers who had been picking off his comrades, even after being wounded himself in the shoulder. His incredible, almost suicidal bravery galvanized his entire company, inspiring them to rise as one and charge, breaking through a seemingly impenetrable German strongpoint. On another part of the battlefield, Private George Joe Sakato, another Nisei soldier, became the embodiment of the go-for-broke spirit. When his platoon was pinned down, facing imminent defeat and the terrifying prospect of being overrun by a German counterattack, Sakato, alone and without hesitation, single-handedly charged a German position defended by a dozen enemy soldiers. In a blur of close-quarters combat, he killed 12 of the enemy, wounded 2 others, and captured 4, turning what was surely impending defeat into a stunning victory and allowing his unit to advance. These individual acts of almost unimaginable courage, multiplied across the entire front, enabled the 442nd to finally break through the heavily fortified German lines. But the cost was staggering, a price paid in unimaginable human suffering. Company K, which had started the offensive with 186 men, was now reduced to a mere 17 riflemen still able to fight. Company I fared even worse, with only 8 of its 185 men remaining unhurt, a casualty rate that would have shattered any other unit. The Vosges Mountains had exacted a terrible, brutal toll. At approximately 1600 hours on October 30th, after 6 days of the bloodiest, most desperate fighting in the European theater, Technical Sergeant Ted Senzaki of the 442nd was among the first Nisei soldiers to reach the lost battalion. His first recorded words, delivered to the exhausted, shell-shocked Texans, have become iconic. "Need any cigarettes?" It was a moment of profound relief, a raw human connection amidst the chaos of war. The link-up had been achieved. The lost battalion was found, but the battle, the ordeal, was far from over. Reaching the lost battalion was only half the mission. They still had to be evacuated, to be safely withdrawn through 2 miles of enemy-held territory, through the very lines the 442nd had just fought so desperately to break. The Germans, refusing to accept defeat, immediately launched furious counterattacks, attempting to close the hard-won gap, resulting in fierce, brutal fighting throughout the night of October 30th. Every inch of ground was contested. Every shadow held a hidden enemy. The evacuation began with the most critically wounded. Nisei soldiers, already exhausted beyond endurance, carried stretchers through the mine-infested forests, under the constant threat of German snipers and relentless artillery fire. Each trip was an agonizing ordeal, often taking hours, with bearers having to stop frequently to rest their aching bodies or to dive for cover as enemy shells screamed overhead. Many more fell during this perilous extraction. Over the next 2 days, the walking wounded and the able-bodied soldiers of the lost battalion were carefully, methodically evacuated, one by one, through the narrow, blood-soaked corridor. Throughout this harrowing period, the 442nd was forced to hold open that vital corridor against repeated, desperate German attempts to cut it off. The fighting was often hand-to-hand, a brutal primal struggle where soldiers resorted to knives, entrenching tools and rifle butts when their ammunition finally ran low. It was a testament to their unwavering determination, their go-for-broke spirit, that they held the line. By November 1st, all 211 surviving members of the lost battalion had been safely evacuated. The 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry, had lost 64 men during their brutal encirclement. But the 422nd had paid a far higher, almost incomprehensible price. More than 800 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, in just 6 days of continuous, hellish fighting. The casualty ratio, nearly 4-to-1, spoke volumes about the cost of their extraordinary heroism. On November 12, 1944, General Dahlquist, perhaps expecting a triumphant display, ordered the 442nd to assemble for a recognition ceremony. He anticipated seeing the full regiment, approximately 3,000 men, marching proudly in formation. Instead, fewer than 900 battle-worn skeletal soldiers stood before him, their uniforms torn, their faces etched with the grim realities of the Vosges. According to multiple witness accounts, a visibly stunned Dahlquist turned to Lieutenant Colonel Virgil Miller, his voice betraying his disbelief, and asked where the rest of the regiment was. Miller's response, delivered with a quiet, devastating power, became legendary among veterans, a searing indictment of a general's callous disregard. General, this is the regiment. The rest are either dead or in the hospital. The devastating, disproportionate casualties immediately ignited burning questions about General Dahlquist's leadership. Why had he sent the 1st Battalion into such an exposed, vulnerable position in the first place? And why, when other, larger, and fresher units were available, had he chosen the understrength, exhausted 442nd for such a desperate, costly rescue mission? Many veterans and historians, looking back with the cold clarity of hindsight, have concluded that Dahlquist, consciously or unconsciously, viewed the Japanese-American soldiers as more expendable than white units, a chilling reflection of the pervasive prejudice of the era. The controversy only deepened when, despite the regiment's catastrophic losses and their evident exhaustion, Dahlquist ordered them to continue offensive operations for another 9 grueling days before finally allowing them to rest. It was a decision that solidified the perception of his indifference to their lives. Years later, at Fort Bragg, when Dahlquist, perhaps seeking some form of reconciliation, approached Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Singles, a Nice officer, saying, "Let bygones be bygones," Singles reportedly refused to shake his hand in front of assembled officers. It was a silent, powerful rejection of a man whose command decisions had cost so many Nice lives. The heroism displayed during the Lost Battalion rescue should have resulted in a cascade of America's highest military decoration, the Medal of Honor. Initially, however, not a single soldier received this supreme award for their actions in the Vosges. Instead, Numerous Distinguished Service Crosses were awarded to soldiers whose incredible bravery, by any objective measure, clearly met the rigorous criteria for the Medal of Honor. This pattern of discrimination, a systemic bias rooted in racial prejudice, tragically affected Asian American soldiers throughout World War II. It would take more than 50 years, a generational struggle for recognition, for justice to finally be done. In the 1990s, catalyzed by the tireless advocacy of Nisei veterans and their allies, Congress ordered a comprehensive review of Distinguished Service Cross Awards presented to Asian American World War II veterans. The review board's findings were damning, revealing systematic, undeniable discrimination in the awarding of medals. On June 21, 2000, over half a century after the guns fell silent, President Bill Clinton stood before the nation and presented the Medal of Honor to 22 Asian American veterans of World War II, including Barney Hajiro and George Sakato, posthumously, for their extraordinary actions during the Lost Battalion rescue. In his powerful remarks, President Clinton acknowledged the profound injustice with words that resonated deeply. Rarely has a nation been so well served by a people it has so ill-treated. It was a moment of national reckoning, a belated yet vital recognition of the courage and sacrifice that had been denied its rightful honor for far too long. The medals, finally bestowed, were not just decorations. They were an apology, a testament to the enduring fight for equality within America's own borders. The statistics of the Lost Battalion rescue tell a stark, almost unbelievable story. 211 surviving members of the 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry, were saved. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team suffered more than 800 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. A casualty ratio of nearly 4-to-1. 6 days of relentless combat to reach the battalion, followed by 9 more days of continued, brutal operations. These numbers alone paint a grim picture of sacrifice, but numbers, cold and impersonal, can never truly capture the human dimension of this epic struggle. These were American soldiers whose families were imprisoned by their own government. They were men who volunteered to fight for a country that, even as they donned its uniform, questioned their very loyalty. They suffered casualties that would have shattered and broken most units, all to prove one undeniable truth, that they were American enough. This was patriotism, born not of blind allegiance, but of a desperate, defiant love for an America that had not yet learned to love them back. The psychological impact on the survivors was severe, a silent internal war that continued long after the Vosges. Many suffered from what we now recognize as PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition little understood and even less supported in veterans at the time. The Japanese cultural concept of gaman, enduring the unbearable with patience and dignity, meant that most Nisei veterans suffered in silence, their inner turmoil largely unseen and unheard. German military records and post-war accounts offer a fascinating, crucial perspective on the battle. They reveal that the Wehrmacht forces were profoundly unprepared for the sheer intensity and ferocity of the 402nd assault. The Japanese-American soldiers, in their relentless pursuit of the Lost Battalion, violated almost every German tactical expectation. They attacked fortified positions frontally, disregarding the accepted norms of engagement. They accepted casualties that, by all military calculations, should have stopped any advance dead in its tracks. And they continued fighting with an almost supernatural resolve, even when grievously wounded. General Friedrich Weiss's after-action reports noted with a mixture of bewilderment and grudging respect, that the 482nd displayed a disregard for casualties unprecedented in our experience fighting American forces. German soldiers, interviewed after the war, recounted tales of wounded Nisei soldiers continuing to fight, of units maintaining cohesion and pushing forward despite losses exceeding 75% of their strength. They spoke of an intensity of close combat that exceeded anything they had experienced against any other Allied force. The defeat in the Vosges, particularly at the hands of a segregated unit, forced German military leadership to reassess their deep-seated assumptions about American military capabilities, and, perhaps more tellingly, the role of racial minorities in the U.S. Army. The supposedly inferior Japanese-American soldiers had broken through positions the Wehrmacht had considered impregnable, shattering not just defenses, but entrenched prejudices. One of the most profound and enduring legacies of the battle was the unlikely yet unbreakable relationship forged between the rescued Texans and their Nisei rescuers. Many of the Texans had grown up in the segregated South, steeped in racial divisions and prejudices, and had, in all likelihood, never met a Japanese American before. Their initial suspicion, their preconceived notions, were utterly annihilated by the shared ordeal, by the raw, undeniable proof of courage and sacrifice. That transformation, from doubt to deference, from suspicion to lifelong brotherhood, was perhaps the greatest victory of all. In 1962, Texas Governor John Connally, recognizing the profound debt of gratitude, proclaimed all members of the 442nd to be honorary Texans, a gesture that resonated deeply with the veterans of both units. For decades, veterans of the 442nd and the Lost Battalion maintained contact, their bond transcending geography and race. They attended each other's reunions, shared stories at weddings, and mourned at funerals. This brotherhood, forged in the crucible of the Vosges, proved stronger than any lingering prejudice. When anti-Japanese sentiment flared during economic downturns in later decades, the Lost Battalion veterans were among the first and most vocal to speak out in defense of Japanese Americans. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, the immense price the Nisei had paid to prove their loyalty, a loyalty questioned by their own government, but undeniably proven on the battlefield. The Lost Battalion rescue had implications far beyond its immediate military importance. The extraordinary, almost unthinkable sacrifice of the 482nd made it impossible, or at least morally indefensible, to justify continued discrimination against Japanese Americans. How could America, a nation founded on principles of liberty and justice, maintain that these were disloyal citizens, when they had suffered such catastrophic casualties rescuing white soldiers, fellow Americans, from a German trap? The very paradox was too glaring to ignore. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team became, and remains, the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in U.S. military history. Their incredible record includes 21 Medals of Honor, most awarded decades later, 29 Distinguished Service Crosses, 588 Silver Stars, 5,200 Bronze Stars, over 4,000 Purple Hearts, and 8 Presidential Unit citations. Their service, their very existence, helped to pave the way for redress for the grievous wrong of Japanese-American internment. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which formally apologized for the internment and provided compensation to survivors. Many 482nd veterans were instrumental in achieving this recognition, tirelessly lobbying and sharing their stories. leveraging their moral authority to fight for justice for their families and community. Military historians continue to debate whether the Lost Battalion rescue was truly necessary from a purely tactical standpoint, and whether the specific use of the 432nd constituted an act of discrimination. The evidence, when scrutinized, points to a complex interplay of motivations and systemic prejudice. General Dahlquist, throughout the European campaign, consistently assigned the 432nd to the most dangerous, most costly missions. He repeatedly ignored requests for rest and reinforcement, pushing the unit beyond reasonable limits. Most tellingly, he had other units available, larger, fresher units that could have attempted the rescue. The tactical decision to send the understrength, exhausted 482nd rather than fresh units from the 36th Division, remains a deeply controversial point. Some historians argue that the 432nd was chosen simply because they were, by reputation, the very best unit available, regardless of their ethnicity or condition. Others contend, with compelling evidence, that they were selected precisely because Japanese-American casualties would be more politically acceptable, more easily dismissed than losses in white units. What is undeniable, what hangs over the entire episode like a pall, is that the 442nd could not, in good conscience, refuse the mission without seeming to confirm the very suspicions about their loyalty that had led to their family's imprisonment. They were trapped by prejudice as surely as the Lost Battalion was trapped by the Germans, compelled to prove their patriotism through an act of supreme, almost suicidal sacrifice. The Lost Battalion rescue offers profound, enduring lessons about citizenship, about the true nature of loyalty, and about the terrible, corrosive cost of prejudice. It starkly demonstrates that questioning the loyalty of citizens based on their ancestry, their race, or their origin not only weakens military effectiveness, but it fundamentally violates the core principles upon which America purports to stand. It reveals how marginalized groups, time and again, are often forced to pay the highest price, to bleed the most, to prove their belonging in a nation that continues to doubt them. Most importantly, it proves with an undeniable, blood-soaked clarity that American identity is not determined by ancestry, by the color of one's skin, or by the name on one's birth certificate, but by sacrifice and by service. The Nice soldiers, fighting in the Vosges, defined patriotism not as a blind, unquestioning allegiance to a perfect nation, but as a fierce, unwavering commitment to fighting for American ideals, even when America itself fell grievously short of those ideals. They fought for the America that could be, not just the America that was. The rescue also powerfully demonstrated the strength that diversity brings to military forces, and, by extension, to any society. The 452nd's extraordinary cohesion, forged not just in shared training, but in shared marginalization and a common struggle against prejudice, arguably made them more effective, more resilient than many conventional units. Their collective determination to prove themselves, to silence the bigots and the doubters, drove them to feats of extraordinary achievement that defied military logic. As the decades passed, the number of survivors, both Nice and Texan, dwindled. Veterans of both the 422nd and the Lost Battalion carried the physical and psychological scars of the Vosges for the remainder of their lives. But they also carried something else, an unbreakable bond, a profound connection forged in those terrible, life-altering days. Lost Battalion veteran Martin Higgins, the very officer who had sent those desperate radio messages from the encirclement, maintained lifelong friendships with his rescuers. Before his passing, he reflected, "Those boys saved our lives, while their families were locked up back home. That's not just courage. That's a kind of heroism I still can't fully understand." His words encapsulate the awe and humility that the Texans felt for their Nisei saviors. A Nisei veteran, Susumu Ito, offered an equally poignant reflection. "We went up that mountain to save American soldiers, not white soldiers or Texas soldiers. American soldiers. That's what we were too, despite everything. American soldiers." This simple yet profound statement cuts to the very heart of the matter. A universal identity earned through shared humanity and shared sacrifice, transcending the superficial divisions of race and origin. Today, the rescue of the lost battalion is studied in military academies worldwide as an exceptional example of small unit tactics, of extraordinary determination, and of human resilience. At West Point, a plaque honoring the 482nd bears an inscription that should echo in the halls of power and in the conscience of every citizen. These soldiers proved that uncommon valor was a common virtue. But the greater legacy, the more profound impact, is social and moral. The immense sacrifice of the 482nd helped to fundamentally transform American understanding of citizenship and belonging. Their service, their undeniable heroism, made it impossible to credibly maintain that loyalty could be determined by race or by ancestry. It chipped away at the foundations of prejudice, demonstrating, in the most visceral way possible, the absurdity and injustice of judging a person by their lineage rather than their character and deeds. Veterans of the 482nd, carrying the moral authority earned through their unimaginable sacrifice, continued to fight for civil rights after the war. Daniel Inouye, who lost his right arm fighting in Italy with the 482nd, went on to become Hawaii's first congressman, and served with distinction in the United States Senate for nearly 50 years. Spark Matsunaga, another 442nd veteran, joined him in the Senate. Together, these Nisei heroes were instrumental in achieving redress for internment, ensuring that such a grave injustice would, hopefully, never be repeated on American soil. The Lost Battalion rescue ultimately reveals the terrible, self-inflicted cost of prejudice, not just to its direct victims, but to the nation that harbors it. The 452nd's excessive casualties were, in part, a direct consequence of their desperate need to prove their loyalty through extraordinary sacrifice. America, in its moment of fear and bias, lost many of its best, most courageous citizens, because prejudice demanded they pay a higher price than others. The battle also starkly exposed deep flaws in military leadership when such decisions are influenced by racial bias. Dahlquist's apparent willingness to expend Japanese-American lives more freely than white lives resulted in unnecessary casualties and remains a stain, a dark mark on his military record. Yet, from this profound injustice, from this crucible of prejudice and war, emerged something truly remarkable, something redemptive. Undeniable proof that American ideals are, in fact, stronger than American prejudices. The Nisei soldiers fought not for a perfect America, a nation without flaws or hypocrisies, but for the America that could be, should be, and sometimes, through the sheer will and sacrifice of its people, manages to become. They fought for the promise of America, even when America itself denied that promise to them. October 30th, 1944, 1600 hours. Technical Sergeant Ted Senzaki of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team emerges from the rain-soaked forest, his uniform caked in mud, his face grim with exhaustion, and makes contact with the lost battalion. After 6 days of the bloodiest fighting in the European theater, after more than 800 casualties, the link-up is finally achieved. The exhausted Texans, barely believing their eyes, can hardly comprehend that their rescuers are Japanese-American. Some had never met an Asian American before. Yet here they stood, having paid an almost unimaginable price to save their fellow Americans. This moment, when prejudice met sacrifice, when assumption met brutal reality, when Americans saved Americans regardless of race or origin, encapsulates both the tragedy and the ultimate triumph of the Lost Battalion rescue. It represents America at its worst, a nation sending its own citizens to die to prove a loyalty it questioned, while simultaneously imprisoning their families behind barbed wire. But it also represents America at its very best, a beacon of hope and resilience, when courage transcends prejudice and shared sacrifice forges unbreakable bonds of brotherhood. In 2000, the Go for Broke Monument was dedicated in Los Angeles, a powerful, lasting tribute honoring all Japanese-American soldiers of World War II. The monument lists over 16,000 names of those who served, including more than 700 who made the ultimate sacrifice in service. At the dedication, Secretary of Veterans Affairs Herschel Gobert delivered a poignant truth. These soldiers fought 2 wars, one against fascism abroad, one against prejudice at home. They won both, though at a cost that should humble us all. The monument proudly bears the 402nd defiant motto, "Go for broke," but perhaps the most fitting tribute, the most heartfelt recognition, comes not from monuments or speeches, but from the Lost Battalion veterans themselves, who, with profound gratitude, insisted that their rescuers' names be included on their own memorials. As one Texas veteran eloquently put it, they are brothers. They earned that with blood. The rescue of the Lost Battalion transcends mere military history to become a defining, pivotal moment in the ongoing story of American identity. It proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that heroism has no color, no race, no predefined ancestry. It demonstrated that loyalty cannot be predicted by one's origin, and that the most profound, most powerful patriotism often comes from precisely those who have the most reason to question their country, yet choose to fight for its ideals. The German officers who dismissed the Nice as inferior fighters learned, in the most brutal fashion, that courage transcends race and stereotypes. The American generals who, perhaps, saw them as expendable, learned the hard truth that every citizen's life has equal, immeasurable value. The Texas soldiers, who had never met a Japanese American, learned that true brotherhood is forged in the crucible of shared sacrifice, not in the arbitrary divisions of bloodline or skin color. Most importantly, America learned, or at least began to learn, a vital lesson, that its greatest defenders might, in fact, come from its most marginalized, most overlooked communities. That true national strength lies not in superficial uniformity, but in the rich tapestry of its diversity, and that the true test of citizenship is not whether you fight for a perfect country, for such a thing does not exist, but whether you fight with every fiber of your being to make your country more perfect, more just, more aligned with its founding ideals. Military historians continue to study the Lost Battalion rescue as one of the most extraordinary episodes in American military history. The tactical achievement, The sheer audacity of breaking through prepared German positions despite overwhelming disadvantages remains awe-inspiring. But the moral significance of the event, its profound impact on the American conscience, ultimately overshadows even the military accomplishment. The rescue demonstrated that American ideals, equality, justice, liberty, could, and sometimes did, triumph over deeply ingrained American prejudices. It proved that what makes America exceptional is not some unattainable perfection, but its profound capacity for redemption, for growth, achieved through the painful yet transformative power of sacrifice. From a purely military perspective, the operation was undeniably costly. More than 800 casualties to save 211 men violates every cold, calculated principle of military economy. It was, by objective measure, an inefficient use of resources. But history, that grand arbiter, judges by different metrics than military manuals. Some victories are worth any price. Some stands, moral as much as military, must be taken regardless of the cost. Some principles, fundamental to a nation's soul, must be defended even unto death. The 402nd understood this with a clarity that few others possessed. They went up that mountain not just to save the lost battalion, but to save America's claim to moral leadership, to uphold its ideals in the face of its own failings. They fought not just against German forces, but against the insidious prejudice that questioned their very place in America. They bled not just for military victory, but for the fundamental principle that all Americans are, in the deepest sense, created equal. The story of the Lost Battalion rescue is, ultimately, about the beautiful, messy complexity of American identity and the redemptive, transformative power of sacrifice. It reminds us, with unflinching honesty, that citizenship is earned not merely through birthright, but through dedicated service, through deeds that speak louder than words. It teaches us that prejudice, in all its forms, weakens the very nation it claims to protect, creating internal divisions that ultimately undermine its strength, and that America's true, enduring strength lies not in uniformity or forced conformity, but in the unwavering determination of diverse peoples, from every corner of the world, to forge a common destiny, to build a more perfect union. The 402nd Regimental Combat Team went for broke in the Vosges Mountains. They gave everything, held nothing back, risked it all. In doing so, they didn't just save 201 trapped soldiers. They helped save America's soul, proving that even in its darkest moments of prejudice and fear, the nation could produce citizens of such extraordinary courage, such profound patriotism, that enemy and ally alike would stand in awe. The forest has long since reclaimed Hill 617. The foxholes have filled with fallen leaves, organic matter slowly consuming the scars of war. The German bunkers have crumbled, succumbing to the relentless march of time and nature. But the memory endures, the memory of young men who climbed an impossible mountain, who bled for those who scorned them, who died for a country that had not yet learned to truly love them back. They were the 402nd Regimental Combat Team. They were Japanese Americans. They were patriots. They were heroes. And they were, above all else, Americans. Their sacrifice echoes across the decades, a timeless reminder to each succeeding generation that freedom is not free, that citizenship demands service, and that the highest, truest form of patriotism is not blind allegiance, but fighting with every fiber of your being to make your country worthy of its own magnificent ideals. In the dark forests of the Vosges, a group of marginalized Americans proved, with an undeniable, blood-stained truth, that loyalty cannot be questioned when it is written in blood, that courage knows no color or creed, and that the true strength of America lies in the willingness of all its people, regardless of origin, to stand together in democracy's defense. The lost battalion was saved, but more importantly, an ideal, a promise, was preserved. The ideal that in America, citizenship is not about where you come from, but about what you're willing to sacrifice for the principles of human dignity and equality. The 402nd proved this truth in the most emphatic, undeniable way possible. They earned their rightful place in America not through words, but through deeds. Not through birthright, but through sacrifice. Not through grudging acceptance, but through undeniable, breathtaking courage. This is their legacy, that from the darkest depths of prejudice can emerge the brightest, most radiant heroism. That those deemed least loyal may prove themselves most faithful, and that America's greatest strength lies not in the uniformity of its people, but in their shared, unwavering commitment to defend ideals larger than any individual, any group, any prejudice. The rescue of the lost battalion remains one of the most extraordinary episodes in American military history. Not just for what was accomplished on that brutal mountainside, but for who accomplished it, and what it ultimately meant. In those 6 harrowing days in October 1944, the 402nd Regimental Combat Team didn't just save a battalion. They helped save the very idea of America itself.